This is a resource developed by participants of the Space Project 2022. This resource outlines inclusive language guidelines for social work and social work students.
Language is more than just a means of communication. It also shapes how we view the world and how we behave. The values and knowledge of the speakers are reflected through their use of language, which can promote both favorable and unfavorable perceptions about individuals, groups, and communities. People's experience of their social environments is largely shaped by language. Language has the capacity to shape realities, empower or oppress, include or exclude, and can ensure individuals, groups, and communities are made visible or invisible. Inclusive language requires empathy and an ability to perceive situations and interactions from diverse perspectives. In this way, the use of inclusive language recognizes the distinctive values, cultures, and experiences of individuals or groups. Inclusive language fosters dignity and respect, as well as a sense of inclusion, belongingness, and a positive sense of self-worth.
Non-inclusive language or communication that lacks empathy may prevent positive communication from taking place. For example, language that is derogatory or discriminating undervalues people or groups, disparages, humiliates, and reinforces inequality in society. Amnesty International Australia claims that non inclusive language contributes to stereotyping, harms people who witness it as well as the people being addressed, can have an insidious effect on individuals who feel excluded, which can impede their progression. Used frequently can have just as harmful effects as more intense but less frequent experiences of harassment, bullying, or discrimination, and can lead to tolerance of negative stereotypes and discrimination if it's hidden behind light humour or jokes. Non inclusive language is a barrier to building relationships, leading to inability or hesitancy to collaborate. Non inclusive language negatively impacts engagement, socialisation, emotional well-being, and motivation. Inclusive and respectful language acknowledges people's preferences and identities and enables everyone to feel reflected, acknowledged, and valued. By recognising the diversity of the individuals, groups, and communities we work with and for, inclusive language helps to ensure that no one is intentionally or unintentionally excluded. Using inclusive language helps to encourage meaningful participation by ensuring that people are treated with respect in a safe environment. Additionally, using inclusive language acts to prevent wrongful assumptions about someone on the basis of age, disability, cultural background, sexual orientation, gender identity, or other characteristics. This language guide and its developers favour language that values and respects human diversity and treats each individual as an individual and does not reduce a person's identity to a stereotype, attribute, or characteristic. It is the view of the developers of this language guide that everyone must take responsibility for fostering and promoting an inclusive society, and that the use of inclusive language is one step in this positive direction. Universities are increasingly diverse environments that are comprised of teachers, staff, and students from various backgrounds and a range of rich life experiences. Charles Darwin University is no exception. Encouraging inclusive language usage on campus can contribute to the development of a friendly, safe, and respectful learning and working environment. This is significant for incorporating equity into campus culture. The more individuals who are informed about and exposed to inclusive language practices, the more people could adopt them and come to experience a stronger sense of belonging as part of the university community. CDU's commitment to fostering equity and inclusion through the use of inclusive language is reflected in the university's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Policy. Under Section 4, Heading 3, Discrimination and Harassment, the following statements relating to the use of inclusive language on campus are stated. The university strives to eliminate discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, bullying, and vilification in all aspects of its operations and to create an environment where members of the university community can work and study in a culture based on mutual respect, including the use of inclusive language and respectful interpersonal interactions. The university will use appropriate language to foster inclusion of staff and students from diverse backgrounds and will be informed in language choices by the express preferences of communities and individuals, including the use of individuals' specified gender pronouns. Inclusive language is also identified as a valued academic writing skill at CDU and is listed on the Library Study Skill page, accompanied by the following statement. At university, there are a number of people from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, as well as people with disabilities, different sexual preferences, and holding varied religious or spiritual belief systems. We all have a responsibility to respect these differences and ensure that our speech and language is appropriate and non-discriminatory. This means avoiding terms that are offensive or using language that portrays certain people in negative ways. The use of inclusive language is also closely aligned with social work values outlined by the Australian Association of Social Workers. These values are social justice, respect for persons, and professional integrity. Social justice, as a form of activism, is informed by principles of equity and inclusion. Because language has the power to shape the way reality is experienced, it also has the ability to provide liberation from the bondage of dominant socio-political realities. One of the available instruments to address social privilege, oppression, and inequality is language guides. It is crucial for social justice to respect and be well informed about inclusive language guidelines. Inclusive language inherently shows respect for persons by valuing the inherent worth, dignity, and capacity of individuals. Professional integrity is concerned with conducting oneself in a moral manner with a commitment to social work ethics and demonstrating accountability. Being aware and knowledgeable about how we think and speak about categories of identification or affiliation is an ethical responsibility. Using inclusive language attempts to make all listeners feel properly represented in the language of ethical speech. Speaking ethically requires paying attention to language, particularly when it pertains to identity and other personal traits. One aspect of ethics that relates to inclusive language is the concept of beneficence. Beneficence is a motivation to behave in the best interests of others. It is a moral obligation to act for the benefit of others, helping them to further their important and legitimate interests, often by preventing or removing possible harms. Using inclusive language is related to this concept of beneficence because it acts to promote the well-being, safety, and equitable participation of every person. Throughout the different social work fields of practice, social workers connect with individuals, families, groups, and communities from hugely diverse backgrounds. Social workers engage with individuals, families, groups, and communities with different values, beliefs such as religious, cultural, and political, sexual orientations, and lived experiences, as well as different cultural, socioeconomic, geographic, and academic and professional backgrounds. The individuals, families, groups, and communities that social workers encounter most likely have identities that consist of more than one intersecting factor, including gender, race, ethnicity, and sexuality. As such, previous guides, which focus on addressing one factor alone, such as inclusive language for working with and referring to LGBTIQ+ people, for example, would not be comprehensive enough for social work contexts. More generalist guides that cover inclusive language broadly are also not explicit enough for social work contexts and do not consider social work specific terminology or contextual language. Inclusive language aims to facilitate acceptance, recognition of value, and empowerment of all members of society through communication that is accessible and respectful. It is language that does not prejudice, discriminate, disparage, abuse, dismiss, stereotype, infantilize, or trivialize individuals because of their membership in a specific group or because of a certain characteristic or attribute. Due to the dynamic and fluid nature of language, the connotations of words can quickly change. Because the implicit meaning of particular terms and phrases may change over time, it is suggested that the general concept of inclusive language should be the primary focus. However, an additional suggested terminology guide is also available. Inclusive language is respectful, accurate, and relevant to all. Inclusive language demonstrates knowing about and appreciates, recognizes, and shows regard for all members of society. Inclusive language reflects social diversity and does not reinforce prejudices, stereotypes, or false assumptions. Inclusive language is meaningful and appropriate to the current and contemporary time conditions and circumstances and integrates and represents diverse interests, values, and perspectives. This is language that ensures each person's voice is being heard and that each person feels seen. The purpose of this language guide is to serve as an initiation into learning about inclusive language and communication. In addition to providing guidelines for using inclusive language generally, this guide also addresses specific considerations for written, verbal, and physical and behavioural, for example, body language, ways of communicating with and addressing specific groups. Individual preferences shouldn't be superseded by the guide, as we acknowledge that individuals have preferred ways of being addressed and referred to. Only address attributes or characteristics when it is absolutely contextually pertinent or necessary to do so. Often it is unnecessary and inappropriate to draw attention to or single out people based on age, cultural background, and other characteristics. Whenever feasible, give the person or group the opportunity to speak for themselves. If you do have to speak on behalf of a group, it is crucial to get input from and consult with a wide range of people to ensure that you are accurately representing the concerned group. A diverse audience with a range of requirements should be able to understand the language and delivery of your content. Consider the consequences of your language. The most prevalent means of expressing attitudes, thoughts, and feelings is through language, which has the power to sway perceptions, mold attitudes, and reinforce stereotypes. Be mindful of the context you are using language in. Some language is appropriate in certain contexts and not in others. Some terms are appropriate when used by members of a group to express their identity, but when used by others outside that group, they are not appropriate and may be perceived as disparaging. Ask if you're unsure. It is not expected that you will be an expert, so when you're unsure of the preferred terminology for an individual or group, it is good practice to ask for clarification or for further information from persons with lived experience. Be willing to reevaluate what you previously believed to be normal and acceptable to say. Be willing to learn and comprehend how some language and interactions might potentially exclude, even unintentionally. People's impressions of one another and ideological prejudices can both be shaped by the language we use. Person-first language prioritizes personhood and nurtures respect, human dignity, and hope. Using a characteristic or attribute, for example, the homeless, to define a group promotes the stigmatization of people by putting excessive focus on the characteristic or attribute. We can reduce generalizations and prejudice by focusing on the person rather than the characteristic or attribute. For example, people experiencing homelessness. Person-centric language emphasizes individuality and does not label or stereotype people based on their association with a group or culture. Inclusive language aims to frame conversations with and about priority populations with focus placed on how barriers impede people's efforts to thrive, rather than depicting priority populations as helpless or powerless. Rather than focusing on a person's or a group of people's perceived deficits or inadequacies, empowering inclusive language acknowledges and emphasizes the value of the skills, knowledge, and abilities and the resiliency of each individual. This is a strength-based perspective. Inclusive language shows acknowledgement and respect for priority populations as experts with intimate knowledge of their own situations and aims not to perpetuate narratives that position practitioners or others in positions of power as saviors. Self-identification can be viewed as a kind of resistance because labels are frequently used to marginalize minorities and persons who differ from the expected or predicted mainstream views, attitudes, and behaviors, social norms. Self-identification can aid in validating experiences of stigma and oppression, foster a sense of belonging, promote self-acceptance, and provide freedom for people to make choices about their life. Self-identification can be liberating and empowering. When feasible, we should use language that respects and reflects the way individuals choose to talk about themselves, rather than the labels dominant society expects us to use. Inquire about the person's preferred terminology or language and show respect for their preferences. An active voice gives us the ability to explicitly identify the perpetrators of injustice and oppression, whether they are individuals or institutions, and holds them accountable. This gives us the chance to resist unconscious and inherent biases that maintain the status quo and systems of power. Using an active voice ensures that language that downplays or overlooks people's lived experiences is avoided. Passive voice directs focus away from the perpetrator and towards the survivor, which acts to partly blame the survivor and can diminish the harm the survivor suffered as a result, and lessens the likelihood that the perpetrator will face criticism. An active voice makes it clear who the perpetrator is and that they are solely responsible for the act and prevents the pathologization of the survivor. When it comes from prominent, influential, or unfamiliar people, it can be difficult to challenge non-inclusive language. However, when we do confront someone about inappropriate language, they are less likely to repeat it in the future and are more likely to alter their view of what is appropriate. Negative feedback has consistently been shown to improve performance, adaptability, and learning. Be aware of how you speak, your intentions, and how your bias may, unintentionally, affect what you say and don't say in regular circumstances. Make language choices intentionally and deliberately to avoid reverting to habitual mechanisms of non-inclusive language use that arise from past use. Opening a dialogue promotes positive change that can be felt not just in your workplace or university, but can have a positive impact on the wider community. A principal issue that can occur when offering feedback is being met with defensiveness of the recipient. This can result in unhappiness or denial about the issue and perceptions of the feedback giver as being prejudiced or insensitive. These attitudes may have a detrimental impact on the feedback giver's participation in the process, as it may cause them to avoid or postpone giving negative feedback to prevent conflict. These are some guidelines that can be used to assist in providing feedback about non-inclusive language in a constructive way and received positively. Make it obvious that there is no inherent personality fault behind the issue. It should be the action or behaviour that is the focus of the evaluation, not the person. Labelling, name-calling, or using loaded terms, such as calling someone a sexist or a racist, might be perceived as an expression of blame or condemnation of a person's character, rather than their behaviour. Under circumstances such as these, criticism could be met with intense feelings of shame, guilt, and dehumanization that are linked to a sensitivity being perceived as the object of contempt and disgust and as being devoid of positive human qualities. In some cases, this shame can manifest itself as rage and violence, emotional responses that are not conducive to effective cooperation or constructive conflict resolution. When providing feedback, it is good practice to address the issue in private. The unwanted negative public attention from receiving feedback in public can cause the person to experience feelings of humiliation. The term humiliation is used to describe both the act committed by a perpetrator and the feeling that is experienced by the person the act is committed against. Even if the perpetrator may only be trying to help, the person receiving the assistance could feel ashamed. Help may therefore humiliate since only the one receiving it, not the person providing it, is able to define it as humiliating. Feelings of humiliation can have consequences such as depression and apathy, foster an urge to retaliate, and perpetuate feelings of anger and expressions of violence. Research has also shown that when there is a witness present, people are more likely to escalate a dispute into a physical altercation. Destructive criticism is feedback that contains threats, sarcasm, lacks consideration for the recipient, and fails to promote better behaviour from the recipient. The recipients of destructive criticism are more likely to experience anger, view feedback negatively, place blame on or harbour mistrust for feedback givers, employ less effective strategies for dealing with inappropriate behaviour or attitudes, such as refusing to alter their behaviour or making excuses for their behaviour, and demonstrates lower self-efficacy. Radical candour is the practice of giving criticism while showing genuine concern, and it can help to promote feedback-seeking behaviour. Radical candour combines the principles of caring personally and challenging directly. In order to care personally, one must put the needs of the other ahead of their own reputation or popularity. At its foundation, caring for someone else entails fostering goodwill and a relationship with them. Caring personally naturally entails considering others and prioritising their needs over your own. The primary focus of challenging directly is humility, not truth or brutal honesty. Delivering feedback under the pretense of truth and honesty positions the feedback giver as an expert, signifying that this person's knowledge and perspective is more valuable than competing or contradictory knowledges and perspectives. Challenging directly entails sharing your opinion and inviting the other person to do the same. People are initially resistant when being criticised, but when criticism is presented with humility, this natural defence mechanism can be dismantled. Radical candour is the proactive and compassionate participation in an uncomfortable and direct feedback process. In order to increase a person's engagement and satisfaction with the negative feedback process, radical candour may assist in diminishing the impact of unpleasant emotions and/or poor self-esteem. Radical candour is considered proactive since it is voluntarily undertaken, rather than being endorsed or encouraged, and allows one to disengage from situational factors such as physical, social, or political environment in order to influence positive change. Being proactive might make someone more eager to put themselves in socially precarious circumstances, since learning is more important than reputation or image. Compassion as a component of radical candor can be expressed through showing feelings of warmth, real concern and care for one another, as well as a strong drive to improve the well-being of one another. Compassion may be motivational as it encourages people to seek out uncomfortable feedback with the intention to improve the overall well-being of the group, for example, the workplace or the community. Compassion encourages the growth of and reciprocal care within a group, which may aid in members forming more secure attachments. The EARN feedback process outlines a procedure for conveying feedback, both motivational and developmental, with the greatest amount of clarity and impact. Motivational feedback refers to the information given to a person concerning their conduct with the goal of encouraging appropriate behaviour. Developmental feedback refers to information concerning their conduct with the goal of improving inappropriate behaviour. EARN stands for event, what was the situation, action, what was the observed behaviour, result, what was the impact of the consequence, next steps, what behaviours need to be changed. Help the person understand the context of the action or behaviour you are giving feedback on, as well as the location and time when it occurred. What was the situation and when and where did the situation occur? Before you continue the discussion too far, make sure the other person understands what you're talking about. Specify the particular action or behaviour you are giving feedback on. What type of behaviour was it? What specifically was said or done by the person in question? Here it is crucial to keep the behaviour, not the person, the centre of attention. Maintain a neutral tone and describe the behaviour or action without passing judgment. Describe the effect or result of the person's action or behaviour. What was the impact or the consequence? What was affected? Be very specific about the issues you are offering feedback on. It is crucial that the individual fully comprehends the significance and repercussions of their choice or behaviour. Ask specifically for the identified action or behaviour to be changed. Offer suggestions for how to proceed. Collaborate on ideas on how to move forward with the person. Although not every person will always be able or willing to recommend next steps, it is still important to let them know that you consider the person as an important part of the solution. By deciding on future steps before you end the conversation, you demonstrate the value of the person as a crucial component of the solution. Overall, feedback should be focused, specifically on what and how, frequent, meaning timely and regular, appropriate environment, the person should feel safe, given with attention, share your feelings and perspective, actionable, behaviour that one can change, and balanced, motivational and developmental. If you do not feel comfortable saying something directly, try the indirect approach. While not as effective as a direct approach, it does at least show that you have noticed the language is not inclusive and you are uncomfortable with this. Soften your statement with language that is not judgmental, use neutral language, and add words such as a bit, quite, just, please, should, or could. Passive-aggressive statements, however, might lead to a counterproductive reaction. Posing your discomfort as a question, such as, should we say something like that in this context? Or, isn't that language a bit unprofessional? Might be enough to encourage the other person to reconsider what was said. Here are some kinds of language that should be avoided when possible. Using different terms, jargon, acronyms, euphemisms, vague language, inaccurate language, violent language, pejorative language, slang, and culturally appropriative language. Use the same terms consistently. If you use different terms for the same concept or object, it may become confusing, as people may wonder if you're referring to the same group or concept or something different. Jargon is special words or expressions used by a profession or group that are difficult for others to understand. For example, critical social work praxis is a social work specific jargon that refers to the critical theory, critical reflection and observations, and practice skills that inform and are implemented in critical social work practice. Acronyms are an abbreviation formed from the initial letters of other words and then pronounced as a word. For example, AASW is the Australian Association of Social Workers. The meaning of the acronym can become unclear or easily forgotten, which may cause confusion. Instead, use a nickname that is shorter but more clear that can be repeated and referred to without the meaning becoming forgotten. For example, the association. A euphemism is a neutral term or phrase that is used as a substitution for one that is considered unpleasant or conveys something that is difficult to accept. Some euphemisms are used to make light of the situation, while others employ bland, unprovocative words to minimize the seriousness or unpleasantness of the situation. Examples include passed away, lost their life, or in a better place instead of died. Catching the bus can be used instead of suicide, or peppered with bullets instead of shot to death. Euphemisms are purposely used to conceal the truth and confuse the real meaning of a situation, making them inherently misleading and/or deceptive. As a consequence, disgusting behaviours may lose their distastefulness, harmful behaviour may become tolerable, and something that is socially undesirable may become something that is socially acceptable. Language that is vague or ambiguous is intended to mislead or deceive by leaving room for multiple interpretations. It is terminology that alludes to something without openly identifying it, making it necessary for people to guess at the true meaning of what is being said. Though the use of vague language is usually inadvertent, being vague or ambiguous can sometimes be used purposefully or tactically in order to avoid addressing an issue or admitting there was even an issue. For example, someone has been in an accident implies a person has experienced an unfortunate incident that happened by chance or without a clear intentional cause, but the condition, for example, the extent of injury the person has sustained, of the person is unclear. Injury in this circumstance could range from minor to no injury to critical to death. The cause of and responsibility for the event occurring is also unclear. Someone has died is similarly vague and can conceal the seriousness and reality of the circumstances of death. For example, the person may have been murdered or died naturally from ailment associated with aging. There is no way to be certain. Inaccurate language is the use of terms or phrases which hide the true meaning of what is being said and are usually factually incorrect. Inaccurate language helps to perpetuate injustices, misrepresents and trivializes the experience of those being spoken about, obscures the seriousness and reality of the circumstances, and can misdirect blame and judgment towards those being spoken about. Inaccurate language negatively impacts the way people think about and respond to an issue and can reinforce stereotypes and misconceptions, confuse definitions, ultimately prohibit individuals from getting access to assistance and support, and in many cases sensationalizes exploitation, violence, and abuse. Violent language is expressions and metaphors that can have clearly or subtly violent meanings, yet are typically used casually and unintentionally. The common usage of this language, especially in Western societies, has normalized a culture of indifference to brutality. Although violent language is frequently used humorously, sarcastically, ironically, and/or figuratively, and is often meant to be harmless, it is important to understand that this language encourages the trivialization of assault and other forms of interpersonal violence, and so minimizes the perceived seriousness within society of that experience. Language that unites sexual and violent images such as "I hit that" or "someone got banged" is a particularly pervasive kind of violent language that serves to normalize the association of sexuality with violence. The greater context must be taken into consideration when deciding whether certain terms or phrases can be perceived as violence. People from diverse backgrounds will most likely interpret and respond to language in different ways. A male, for instance, probably won't have a point of comparison to understand what it feels like for a woman to hear certain terms and phrases. For instance, using the word castrated as a metaphor for losing control and power links weakness to being female or being feminine, and using the term suck it as a threat trivializes sexual assault. Cultural appropriation is the inappropriate and/or unacknowledged adoption of an element or elements of one culture or identity by members of a dominant culture. Cultural appropriation can include the appropriation of words and phrases as well as adopting accents, dialects, and speech patterns from diverse cultural groups. Cultural appropriation is disrespectful, unacceptable, and can be perceived as a form of desecration. Cultural appropriation in all forms, including of language, is harmful because it can perpetuate stereotypes and exploit groups that are discriminated against, and give the dominant group credit for elements of a culture that they have taken, which reinforces power imbalances. Once an element of culture is stolen, the origin, meaning, and true intent are no longer clearly recognized or truly understood. Cultural appropriation may lead to lower self-esteem and a weakened feeling of community worth among individuals whose culture has been appropriated. And for individuals attempting to learn about their culture and identity, cultural appropriation can cause confusion. A pejorative is a term or phrase that conveys an unfavorable or insulting meaning, a lack of regard for something or someone, and/or a poor opinion of them. This language can also be used to convey animosity towards, contempt for, or criticism of someone or something. Pejoratives are degrading, destructive, show a lack of respect and intolerance, foster hostility, and support misconceptions about interpersonal and societal issues, especially between class and culture. Pejorative language may have a dehumanizing effect and can desensitize individuals to the systemic, political, and/or socio-economic forces that affect a person's circumstances and status in society. The use of pejorative language over time can lead to people being less compassionate for those who do not share or conform to one's beliefs, values, and/or expectations. Slang is a type of language consisting of words and phrases that are regarded as very informal, are more common in speech than in writing, and are typically restricted to a particular context or group of people. For example, bogan is Australian slang for an uncouth or unsophisticated person regarded as being of low social status. Slang can become a slur if it expresses a negative or disrespectful connotation, a low opinion of someone or something, or a lack of respect for someone or something. A slur can be used to express criticism, hostility, or disregard. While slang should be avoided because it is not necessarily understood by every person in every context and can confuse people, a slur should always be avoided because it is harmful and offensive and can reinforce derogatory stereotypes. Some slurs have been reappropriated or reclaimed by targeted groups as a mechanism for empowerment. However, it is highly inappropriate for individuals outside of target groups to use these words. We thank you for engaging with our resource. We hope you have learned something new about inclusive language.